They told him he wasn't on the list. A man who once carried a dying soldier through a jungle of bullets now turned away at the gates of that same soldier's funeral with nothing but a note in his pocket and years of silence in his eyes. What they didn't know was that this funeral was about to stop cold, because someone finally looked up and recognized what honor really looks like. If that opening hits something deep, don't just feel it. Tap like, share it with someone who deserves better, and subscribe now, because you're about to witness how quiet dignity turns into thunder. Clarence Delroy, 82, stepped off the train in Washington, D.C. with the same care he'd used to press his slacks that morning, not because anyone would see, but because he knew what respect meant, even if no one gave it back. He wore a brown wool blazer that didn't quite fit his shoulders anymore, shoes polished with the kind of shine that comes from years of showing up, even when no one says thank you. He wasn't headed to see family. No reunion, no ceremony for him. Just one promise left to keep. To say goodbye to a man who once bled in his arms and called him brother. But as soon as his foot touched the curb at Arlington, the first crack of insult landed. A young officer, barely old enough to shave, looked him over like a mistake. The letter from the widow was real, handwritten, folded with care. It even smelled faintly of her perfume. On it, Clarence Delroy, please escort to front, sincerely, Rebecca Beckett. It was signed by the wife of General Thomas Beckett, the man being buried under full military honors just 100 yards away. Clarence had served beside him, bled beside him, and now showed up alone to pay his final respects. But when he handed that envelope to the officer at the gate, the kid squinted, gave a tight smile, and asked, "Are you on the official list, sir?" That "sir" wasn't respect. It was protocol. And when Clarence shook his head, explaining he was invited personally, the taller guard stepped in. "Without credentials, we can't let you in. Orders from the family liaison." They didn't read the note. They didn't look again. They saw an old man with no medals on his chest and decided he didn't belong. Clarence didn't argue. Not really. He had too much mileage on his bones to waste it on boys who'd never seen the inside of a real war. He just stepped back, holding his hat in one hand and the envelope in the other, watching rows of black cars pull through, one after the next. Officers with crisp ribbons and clean salutes walked in without pause. Somewhere under that canopy, the flag-draped casket was waiting, and so was a story none of those uniformed men knew, the one that lived in the worn-out photo folded in Clarence's coat pocket. Two young men in muddy fatigues, one with his arms slung around the other, both grinning like the world hadn't just exploded around them. Beckett had called Clarence his shadow. Not in the press, not in speeches, but when the bullets came, when the screams tore through the jungle, Clarence was the only reason Beckett ever came home. He stood by the stone wall, knees aching from the ride, sweat gathering under his collar. A younger soldier passed by, and Clarence called out, "Son!" He showed the letter again, quiet but steady. The soldier read it, nodded, and disappeared into the crowd, promising to check with someone in charge. Clarence waited. 5 minutes, 10. The bugler began to warm up. A chaplain's voice could be heard at a distance. The chairs were filling. His seat, if it even existed, was being taken. No one came back. Not the officer, not the kid, just a parade of polished boots and blank glances. The wall between Clarence and his friend's farewell got taller by the minute, not because of hate, but something worse. Indifference. Still, Clarence didn't leave, because some men are carved from patience, not pride. He leaned against that wall, pulled out the envelope again, and opened it with weathered hands. Inside, a short line written by Rebecca herself. "Thomas would want you sitting with us. Always." That word, always, hit like a drumbeat, louder than the bugle, sharper than any salute. And yet here he stood, locked out by people who didn't even ask his name. But this wasn't just about protocol. This was about the quiet war veterans like Clarence fight every day, the war against forgetting, against erasure, against the silence that settles over men who gave everything and returned home invisible. And right now, Clarence wasn't just fighting for a seat. He was standing for every man who's ever been left off a list that wouldn't exist without him in the first place. This isn't the end of his story, not even close, but if you've ever been looked past, if you've ever held proof in your hands while someone with a clipboard told you it wasn't enough, then you already know why this matters. You already know who Clarence is. So don't scroll past. Hit that like button. Send this to someone who's ever been forgotten, and stay right here. Because in the next part, we go back to the jungle, where this bond was forged. And the truth Clarence carries? It's written in blood. Before anyone ever called him General Beckett, he was just Tom. Just a loudmouth preacher's son with a busted tooth and a slingshot that never missed. And Clarence? Just a mill kid with too many chores and a gift for silence. Their bond didn't start in boot camp. It started on Montgomery Road in the sticky Alabama summer of '49, when Tom threw a rock at a bully chasing Clarence and caught a black eye for it. From that day forward, they were inseparable, but it wasn't until 1968, halfway around the world, that Clarence would carry Tom on his back, soaked in blood, through a jungle that swallowed weaker men whole. And in that moment, before ranks and ribbons, Clarence made a promise no piece of paper could ever match. It was supposed to be a recon run, 2 days, light movement, minimal contact. That's what the briefing said. But Quantum had other plans. The enemy didn't wait for welcome mats. They came with mud, ambush, and fear. Gunfire erupted from the ridgeline like someone had lit the sky on fire. Clarence dropped flat into the muck, the sound of bullets snapping overhead like cruel fingers. "Beckett!" he shouted. Nothing. Smoke. Chaos. Then a shape tumbled through the brush. Tom, bleeding from the shoulder, crawling with one leg dragging uselessly behind him. Clarence didn't hesitate. He leapt over a fallen tree and grabbed him by the collar. "You stay with me," he growled. But Tom groaned, voice weak. "Leave me, damn it. I'll slow you down." Clarence didn't argue. He reached into Tom's vest, yanked a smoke grenade, pulled the pin, and let the purple haze explode behind them like a curtain drawn against death. They didn't stop running until Clarence's legs gave out beneath a shallow trench. He dropped Tom in, checked the wounds, shoulder grazed, thigh worse, but not fatal. He slapped a field dressing on while Tom cursed through gritted teeth. And then Clarence did something he didn't expect. He laughed. Not because anything was funny, but because the fear had nowhere else to go. And Tom, bleeding out with one eye swollen shut, laughed with him. That was the moment. Not the medals, not the citations, that muddy, God-forsaken trench, where one man carried another because walking away simply wasn't in his blood. That's what Clarence carried now. Not rank, not recognition, but the memory of a man who only survived because someone behind him refused to let go. After the evac, Clarence disappeared from the reports. No commendation, no medal, just an asterisk in Beckett's file under assisted extraction. When they got back stateside, Tom tried to put him in for a Bronze Star. Clarence tore up the paperwork. "I didn't do it for hardware," he said. "I did it 'cause your mama still sends me pound cake on my birthday." They laughed, as they always did, but Clarence knew the truth. One of them came back with a uniform and a future, and the other came back to a country that never quite forgave him for surviving in the wrong skin. In Alabama, Clarence went back to the janitor's closet at Langston High, while Tom climbed the ranks, but their bond never cracked. Every holiday, without fail, Beckett would show up on Clarence's porch with a bottle of rye and a story too dangerous to write down, because even though the world saw a general, Tom never forgot who saved his life. And yet, as Clarence stood now outside the cemetery, rejected by protocol, dismissed by 20-somethings with clean boots and tighter collars, all he had was a memory. And that memory should have been enough to get him in. But memory doesn't scan on a clipboard. Loyalty doesn't wear a name tag. And real service, the kind that pulls bodies through gunfire, doesn't always come with paperwork. That's what makes this story matter, because how many men like Clarence stand just outside the gates? How many shoulders carried this country through hell and came back to find they were no longer on the list? If you feel that If your chest got tight reading that jungle scene, if part of you wanted to scream on behalf of every Clarence who got left off the roll call, then don't let this stop here. Like this story, so the algorithm knows this kind of dignity still matters. Share it with someone who served or someone who forgot. And stay with me, because in the next part, Clarence tries one last time to get in, and what happens next will test every quiet bone in his body. The sun was climbing now, burning through the early fog that had once softened the scene. But nothing softened the sting in Clarence's chest. Not heat, not time, not even the polite nod of the gray-suited man who passed without stopping. Clarence stood quietly by the wall, blazer dusted from leaning against it too long, sweat forming under his collar. He watched family after family stroll past, waved through by officers who didn't ask questions. One woman in black adjusted her sunglasses and brushed against him, never looking back. The envelope, still folded, still warm from his palm, had now been rejected 3 times. By men who couldn't have told you where Kontum was on a map, let alone what happened there in '68. And yet they held the power to turn away the man who'd carried the general they were all here to bury. He stepped forward again. Not because he expected a different outcome, but because decency is sometimes a muscle memory you just don't let go of. Clarence tapped the shoulder of the younger officer, voice lower now, but firmer. "Sir, I came here because General Beckett asked me to. That envelope, that's not just a piece of paper. That's from his wife. We've known each other 70 years. The officer, clearly uncomfortable, gave a quick glance to his colleague. Then came the line Clarence had already heard. "Sorry, Mr. Delroy, we've got strict protocol today. I can't make that call." Clarence's throat tightened, not out of anger, but exhaustion. He looked past the officer, toward the canopy where a chaplain had begun speaking. The eulogy was starting. His seat was vanishing. And still, no one would lift a finger. Then came a flicker of hope. A young coordinator with a clipboard, barely old enough to drink, walked by briskly. Clarence called out again. The coordinator stopped, listened, nodded. "Let me check with the family liaison," he said, then vanished behind the tent like all the others. 10 more minutes passed. Clarence didn't move. He didn't sit. He didn't lean this time. He stood like a man guarding something, though in truth, all he had left to guard was memory. The clipboard kid never came back either, but the ceremony, it moved on, like he didn't exist. It moved on like people like him had never mattered to begin with. Clarence reached into his inside coat pocket and pulled out something he hadn't touched in decades. A faded green cloth armband with 2 stitched letters. T.B. Beckett had made it with fishing line the day after the jungle. "You wear that," he'd said, "so even if I don't make it out next time, I'll still ride with you." Clarence slid it onto his wrist now, hand trembling as he adjusted it. Nobody looked, no one said a word. But for him, that armband was more credential than any laminated badge, more authority than a name on a spreadsheet, and as he turned once more toward the gate, something inside him settled, not with peace, but with purpose. This isn't just about Clarence anymore. It's about what happens when systems mistake formality for respect, when rules are used not to protect dignity, but to deny it. Clarence never asked for a parade. He asked for a seat beside the man he carried through death's front door. And if you felt that today, if your heart cracked even slightly while reading this, then honor that feeling. Like this story, if you've ever had to prove you belonged where your life already paid the price. Share it with someone who's ever stood at a locked door, knowing what was inside belonged to them too. And don't blink now, because in the next part, everything changes with one silent walk, and a salute that stops time. The prayer had already begun when the shift in air took hold. It wasn't loud, it wasn't announced, but like a weather change you feel in your bones before the clouds move, something broke through the static of indifference. Clarence stood at the same wall, armband now on his wrist, hands folded, head lowered not in defeat, but in discipline. His fingers pressed the envelope again, though he already knew the words by heart. He hadn't moved in nearly half an hour. And that stillness, that refusal to shrink or lash out, was exactly what made him suddenly visible to the one man in uniform who knew the difference between protocol and principle. General Raymond E. Callister didn't ask. He noticed. From his seat beneath the canopy, surrounded by polished brass and grieving decorum, he looked past the curated attendees and saw the figure by the gate. He saw not a man waiting, but a man held, not by guards, but by the weight of legacy unacknowledged. Callister leaned toward the staff sergeant beside him. "Who is that?" he asked, tone direct but unhurried. The sergeant glanced up, blinked. Sir, I believe that's a civilian. He didn't have credentials." Callister turned fully, voice sharper now. "That man's not standing like someone who wandered in off the metro. Why is he out there?" The sergeant flinched. "I don't know, sir." Callister didn't wait for more. He rose. Boots hit pavement with authority. He didn't signal aids, didn't announce. He just walked. Through rows of high-ranking officials, past colonels and ambassadors, through the breathless murmurs of those who couldn't understand why the funeral had suddenly paused. The chaplain's voice faltered, eyes following him. You could feel the shift, like a record scratch in the middle of a hymn. Guests craned their necks, phones dropped back into pockets. Uniformed officers straightened, not because they were told, but because something real had just cut through the ceremony. The two junior officers at the gate saw him coming and froze. "General Callister, sir," one began, clipboard trembling. Callister held up a hand. Then he turned to Clarence. He didn't start with questions. He started with presence. "Sir, what is your name?" Clarence raised his eyes, slow and steady. "Clarence Delroy," he answered, voice dry but proud. "You knew General Beckett?" the general asked, already knowing the answer. Clarence nodded once. "Since I was 9, served with him in 68, Kontum." Callister paused. Then, in front of the gatekeepers, in full view of the rows of mourners and the sea of brass, he raised his right hand and gave Clarence Delroy a full military salute. Not ceremonial, not hollow. Real, direct, reverent. And in that salute, every refusal Clarence had endured evaporated. Every doubt about whether he belonged snapped, like a dry twig beneath a boot. Callister lowered his hand, looked him squarely in the eye and said, "Mr. Delroy, would you allow me the honor of escorting you to your seat?" Clarence didn't speak, he just nodded once. Slowly. He took the general's arm, and together they walked, not rushed, not theatrical, but like men who knew every step mattered. As they passed through the gates, past the silent guards and stunned guests, you could feel the funeral change shape. This wasn't a detour. This was the correction, the restoration, the kind of moment no order could demand, but that duty, real duty, made inevitable. And if that doesn't shake something loose inside you, then rewind. Because we just watched the invisible become undeniable. We watched power choose humility over procedure. That walk down the aisle wasn't just Clarence's redemption. It was every person who's ever been told, "Wait here," when they should have been welcomed with open arms. If this part lit a fire in you, don't let it go cold. Like this story, share it with someone who's ever stood outside a locked door they already earned the key to, and buckle in. Because Part 5 holds the letter Clarence never expected to receive, and the truth that rewrites everything. Clarence didn't sit down right away. He stood beside the casket, the general's wife clutching his hand with a quiet kind of reverence. Rebecca didn't say much. She didn't have to. Her fingers trembled slightly as she pulled a folded letter from her purse, slid it into his palm like a sacred transfer. "He wrote this a few days before," she whispered. "Said it was for you. Told me if something happened, you'd know when to read it." Clarence felt the paper between his fingers. It wasn't heavy, but it landed like a weight strapped to his chest. He didn't open it yet. He didn't need to, not until he had the silence he'd been waiting for all day. After the ceremony ended and the last shell from the rifle salute clinked onto the ground, The crowd began to shift, chairs scraping on pavement, conversations bubbling up in hushed tones. Clarence remained seated. He wasn't rushing through this. You don't rush through history. He placed the folded flag gently on his lap, laid the unopened letter on top, and breathed. That breath felt like it traveled back 50 years. Through jungle and Alabama summers, back to porches and church basements and jokes whispered over watermelon rinds. And when he finally opened the envelope, the first line gripped his chest so tightly he thought the funeral had stopped again. Clarence, if you're reading this, I made it where you can't follow. Not yet, anyway. But you already knew that. The truth is, I never knew how to say thank you without choking on pride. But not anymore. Clarence read slowly, mouth parted slightly, eyes darting across the page. I think about that day in Quantum more than I admit, not because I almost died, but because you didn't let me, and I've been trying to earn that moment ever since. The handwriting was shaky but familiar, each letter packed with meaning that only two men could ever fully understand, and then came the line that stripped every wall Clarence had built to survive. I tried to put you in my promotion ceremony, but I didn't have the guts to say your name out loud, not in front of cameras. I regret that. Deeply. Clarence's hand clenched, not out of anger, but because even now, in death, Beckett's words came like an embrace and a gut punch all at once. The letter continued. You were the bravest man I ever knew. You didn't wear stars, but you carried them on your back. When people ask me how I made it through, I want them to know I didn't. We did. And then, with the simplicity only truth can carry, Beckett ended it. Don't let anyone forget that you were the reason I came home, not the medals. You. Clarence folded the letter slowly, carefully, like it might tear if rushed. Around him, people began to notice, not because he spoke, but because the weight of what he held was obvious in how still he became. You don't need a uniform to serve. You don't need a title to save someone's life. Sometimes, all it takes is staying in the fire, staying through the silence, staying until someone finally says, you were there. You mattered. If this story is pushing something deep in your gut, it's because you know someone like Clarence. Maybe you are someone like Clarence. Overlooked, undervalued, remembered only in private. And it's time to bring those names forward. Hit like not for algorithm, but for recognition. Share this for every voice that never made it to the microphone. And come back for the final part, because in part 6, the salute you didn't expect comes from someone who wasn't even born when Clarence served, but who saw him and knew. That's what honor looks like. Clarence didn't rush. When the last prayer fell quiet, and the folding chairs began scraping across pavement like forgotten echoes, he stayed seated, still holding the flag like it might vanish if he loosened his grip. The letter from Beckett, now folded with near-sacred care, sat under his palm, its weight heavier than any military medal ever forged. This wasn't closure. This was recognition finally arriving decades late and just in time, and he knew he owed one last thing. Not to the general, not to the crowd, but to the man in the casket. The boy who once gave him half his sandwich in the 3rd grade, and later bled beside him in the jungle. He stood, slowly. His knees creaked in protest, his back whispered reminders of years on concrete floors, but his soul was upright. He walked to the casket, each step quiet and deliberate, not dramatic, just necessary. He placed his hand gently on the polished wood and closed his eyes. For a moment the cemetery disappeared, and it was just them again. 2 kids sneaking peaches, 2 men laughing in a foxhole, 2 old souls who never needed anyone else to understand what they shared. Clarence whispered something. No one else heard it. That wasn't for them. That was just between brothers. But then he turned, and without fanfare, without a mic, he spoke. I know I ain't supposed to speak, he began, voice steady but strong. But I need to say something. Not for the general, not even for his family. For me. The murmurs faded. People paused. He took another step toward the crowd. "I knew Tom Beckett before any of y'all called him sir. Before the medals, before the parades, before the world remembered him as a hero. I knew the boy who stole my lunch twice and gave it back both times 'cause he felt bad." A few light chuckles rippled across the front row. Clarence let them settle. "I carried him once, bleeding, half-conscious, jungle-crawling with death, and you know what? He carried me, too. Not always with his hands, but in ways that mattered just as much." Clarence turned toward the casket, raised his right hand, and saluted. It wasn't perfect, elbow a little wide, fingers trembling slightly, but it was full of something no one could measure. Memory, sweat, blood, loyalty, and in that moment something happened that no one could have predicted. General Callister rose from his seat, without a word, without a cue, and returned the salute. Clean, sharp, full of weight, the kind of salute you give only when you know you've just seen something sacred. Then, like dominoes, the ranks followed. One by one, officers stood. Lieutenants, captains, even cadets, halfway to the parking lot, turned and snapped to attention, present arms. No one barked the command, they just knew, because in Clarence, they didn't see an old man. They saw the foundation, the reason their uniforms meant anything at all. Callister walked over. No aides, no speechwriters. Just two men, face to face. "Mr. Delroy," he said, extending a hand, "thank you for your service to this country and to General Beckett." Clarence took his hand. One shake, firm, honest. "He honored me long before this day," Clarence said. Callister nodded. "But today, you honored all of us." And that was it. No cameras, no ceremony, just a moment where truth outranked every star on every shoulder. The crowd dispersed slowly. People didn't rush to their cars. They lingered. Something real had happened, and no one wanted to leave before it soaked in. Clarence remained. He walked to a stone ledge and lowered himself down, the folded flag still under his arm. His knees ached, his chest was tight, but there was peace here now. Earned peace. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out one final memory. A dog tag, rusted slightly around the edges, with Beckett's name still clear, the one he'd been handed back in '70 before Beckett's last deployment. Clarence ran his thumb over it, then stood again and approached the casket one final time. He placed the tag gently on the wood, beside the flag. "Time you went home too," he said softly. "I carried it long enough." He stepped back, looking down at the grave that would soon close over 1,000 stories no newspaper ever told. "You don't owe me anything," he whispered. "You paid it in full. Every call, every visit, every time you fixed something at my house just to feel normal again. You showed up, and you stayed." His voice cracked for the first time. "You let me be seen." Then Clarence did something rare for him. He closed his eyes and prayed. Not for Beckett's soul, because he knew that part was fine. He prayed for the world, for the next kid like him, standing on the outside of some gate they'd built without understanding who was on the other side. He prayed they'd be noticed. Before it was too late. A week later, Clarence was on his porch fixing his neighbor's screen door when her grandson came sprinting across the yard holding a phone. "Mr. Clarence, you're on the internet." He looked up, blinking. "I'm what now?" The boy flipped the screen. There it was. Grainy footage of the funeral, Callister's walk, the salute, the crowd's hush. Over 1 million views. 4-star general stops funeral to salute unknown elder. Clarence smiled faintly. "Oh, I ain't unknown, son. Just quiet." Back inside, the folded flag sat in a glass case on his mantel, the letter tucked beneath it. He never once showed it off, but when people came over, neighbors, veterans, kids who didn't know their history, Clarence would pour them tea and talk about everything except the funeral. Until one day, while walking past a park, he saw a young man in uniform sitting alone, nervous, pale. Clarence sat beside him without a word. After a while, the soldier said, "My granddad showed me your video. Said, that's what honor looks like." Clarence just nodded. We just tried not to forget each other." The young man stood, saluted. No cameras, no microphones, just one generation acknowledging the shoulders they stand on. Clarence tipped his hat and walked on. So if this story reached you, if it made you feel something, don't let it stop with you. Share it. Tell someone about Clarence Delroy, not for fame, but because recognition delayed is still worth delivering. Because someone out there is still holding the flag, still waiting at the gate, and they deserve to be seen before the door closes again. Leave a comment below to let us know where you are watching from, and if you like fascinating stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow we have another incredible story, and there are many surprises waiting for you in the next parts.